Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has firmly stated that Ukraine will not accept any peace agreement formulated without its direct involvement. This declaration comes in response to recent discussions between U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, who have agreed to initiate negotiations aimed at ending the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. On February 12, 2025, President Trump announced a lengthy and highly productive phone conversation with President Putin, during which both leaders consented to commence immediate negotiations to cease hostilities in Ukraine.
With Vladimir Putin, and were there any preconditions?
No, we had a great call, and it lasted for a long time, over an hour. President Putin wants peace.
Trump indicated that these discussions would likely take place in Saudi Arabia, marking a notable shift in the U.S. approach to the conflict. He emphasized the urgency of achieving peace, even if it entails Ukraine making territorial concessions and forgoing its aspirations for NATO membership. This stance has raised concerns among European allies and Ukrainian officials, who fear that such negotiations might undermine Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. In response, President Zelensky has been unequivocal, asserting that Ukraine, as a sovereign nation, cannot accept any agreements made without its participation. He stressed the necessity of including European partners in the negotiations to ensure a comprehensive and lasting resolution to the conflict. Zelensky's position reflects a broader sentiment among European leaders, who have expressed alarm over the prospect of being sidelined in critical discussions affecting regional security. The Trump administration's approach has also elicited varied reactions within the U.S. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth suggested that expecting Ukraine to regain its pre-2014 borders is unrealistic, and that pursuing such an objective might prolong the war and exacerbate human suffering. He further indicated that the U.S. does not support Ukraine's NATO membership as part of a peace agreement and expects European nations to assume a more substantial role in providing financial and military assistance to Ukraine.
We want, like you, a sovereign and prosperous Ukraine. But we must start by recognizing that returning to Ukraine's pre-2014 borders is an unrealistic objective. Chasing this illusionary goal will only prolong the war and cause more suffering. A durable peace for Ukraine must include robust security guarantees to ensure that the war will not begin again. This must not be Minsk 3.0. That said, the United States does not believe that NATO membership for Ukraine is a realistic outcome of a negotiated settlement. Instead, any security guarantee must be backed by capable European and non-European troops.
This perspective signifies a departure from previous U.S. policies and has prompted discussions about the future of transatlantic relations and NATO's role in European security. European leaders have been vocal in their concerns. French President Emmanuel Macron convened an emergency summit in Paris to address the potential implications of U.S.-Russia bilateral negotiations on European security. The European Union's foreign policy chief, Kaja Kallas, criticized the U.S. approach, describing it as appeasement towards Russia and emphasizing that any peace agreement excluding Ukraine and European nations is destined to fail. This sentiment underscores the importance of a unified and inclusive strategy in resolving the conflict. The Kremlin, on the other hand, has expressed optimism regarding the recent developments. Russian officials and state media have lauded President Trump's decision to engage directly with President Putin, viewing it as a potential pathway to lifting international sanctions and restoring Russia's global standing. However, the exclusion of Ukraine from initial talks has been a point of contention, with Ukrainian officials warning that any agreements reached without their consent would be unacceptable and potentially destabilizing. As the situation unfolds, the international community remains attentive to the dynamics between the U.S., Russia, Ukraine, and European allies. The 61st Munich Security Conference has brought together world leaders, defense officials, and policymakers to discuss pressing global security challenges. In this conference, U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance delivered a critique of European nations, arguing that internal policies, including migration management and restrictions on free speech, posed greater threats to stability than external adversaries like Russia and China.
But while the Trump administration is very concerned with European security and believes that we can come to a reasonable settlement between Russia and Ukraine, and we also believe that it's important in the coming years for Europe to step up in a big way to provide for its own defense, the threat that I worry the most about vis-a-vis Europe is not Russia, it's not China, it's not any other external actor. And what I worry about is the threat from within, the retreat of Europe from some of its most fundamental values, values shared with the United States of America.
His remarks provoked swift rebuttals from European leaders, including German Chancellor Olaf Scholz and Defense Minister Boris Pistorius, who emphasized that democratic values remained at the core of European unity and resilience. In the conference, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky took the stage with an urgent appeal, calling for the creation of a unified European army to counter Russia's growing military buildup.
Let's be honest, now we can't rule out the possibility that America might say no to Europe on issues that threaten it. Many leaders have talked about Europe that needs its own military, an army of Europe. And
He warned that Europe could no longer rely solely on the United States for security, citing concerns that future U.S. administrations might scale back commitments to NATO and European defense. Zelensky's remarks highlight the shifting dynamics of international security, highlighting the necessity for Europe to take control of its own destiny. While the potential U.S.-Russia negotiations loomed over discussions, Ukraine remained steadfast in its refusal to accept any agreements made without its involvement. Zelensky reaffirmed Ukraine's aspiration for NATO membership despite comments from U.S. officials suggesting that such an outcome was off the table. His remarks underscored a broader reality. In a world where power balances were shifting, Europe had to assert itself not just as an economic force, but as a military and diplomatic one as well. As the conference concluded, the prevailing message was clear: Europe must forge its own security path, with or without U.S. backing. The decisions made in Munich would reverberate beyond the conference halls, shaping policies and alliances in an increasingly unpredictable global landscape.